think he's a completely intriguing type of person. I think he's proud of who he is, and he should be proud of who he is.
So what does being goth mean exactly? I've noticed how a lot of people kind of have a distorted image of goth, and that poses a problem today because there are so many subgenres and new countercultures inspired by goth culture, which means so much more than just being pessimistic, or if it means that you're pessimistic at all. In my humble opinion, I believe it's important to understand where it comes from and how it was born. So today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the history of gothic culture and its origins. Also, I just wanted to remind you guys that although what I do is based on research, a lot of my opinion is also involved, so feel free to add on to my knowledge or voice out your own opinion in the comments down below as well. Also, I wanted to quickly mention that I will be talking about gothic culture in an aesthetic perspective. Unfortunately, this isn't an episode about music, although we will be talking a lot about music. Anyways, let's begin. So everything begins with the punk movement, a musical genre derived from rock that emerged in the 1970s in the US, but strangely it would remain quite underground in the US, while it first gained prominence in the UK during the later half of the 1970s. Its significance was largely a response to Margaret Thatcher's narrow-minded policies, which spurred leftist militant movements, which is reflected in both the fashion and music of punk. The music of punk is aggressive, with some of the bands even openly mocking the British monarchy. And in terms of punk fashion, it defies social norms, featuring clothing bought from thrift stores or taken from older siblings. Outfits often include torn garments with slogans. And there is also this do-it-yourself culture, which is typical in punk. Some of the common attires that we find in punk would include band t-shirts, tartans, and heavy flat boots, like Dr. Martens. However, fetish elements are also prevalent, with chains, spikes, and leather being prominent. And the leather jacket adorned with band patches is one of the most emblematic items of punk. So basically, punk initiates a revolutionary wave in social, musical, and fashion realms. But you may wonder, what is the link between gothic style and punk? Don't worry, we'll be getting there soon. So around 1977, music press began noticing the rise of a new rock subgenre called post-punk. In this style, guitars take a backseat, with more emphasis on bass, synthesizers, and sometimes even music boxes. In France, it was referred to as Cold Wave, a minimalist offshoot of punk rock, like Joy Division, Susie and the Bedsheets, and Virgin Prunes. As more bands of this genre occurred, there were also more labels popping up trying to characterize them, such as Dark Wave, Positive Punk, and Minimal Wave, reflecting the evolving alternative rock scene. In short, the music lovers are trying to dissect what the alternative rock scene is experiencing. And among those post-punk groups, we find the roots of the gothic movement. Notably, Susie and the Banshees released their debut album, The Scream, in 1979, which was heavily influenced by punk music. And the group is led by Susie Sue, who is still an icon of post-punk today, but especially of the gothic movement. In her music, we find a very diverse and varied themes, blending both anti-conformist punk ideology, sometimes feminist lyrics, but also slightly more mythical and dark themes. With songs like Happy House, for example, she denounces a conformist society in which everyone pretends to be happy. In the clip, we see her in a Harley Quinn pattern, but especially with an oversized collar, giving an impression that she is wearing a circus costume. But a quick note, this Harley Quinn costume is quite far from her usual style. At the beginning of her music career, her style is primarily punk. She has wild hair, a pale complexion, and her eye makeup is done in an unprecedented way. Besides her very long eyeliners, she also heavily emphasizes her eyebrows to create an angular shape in the inner corner, blending her eyeshadow and eyebrows. She also wore punk elements, like leather mixed with romantic-inspired motifs, such as lace and ruffles. Moreover, she plays a lot on an androgynous side. Wearing both oversized blazers and high heels, you can feel the influence of glam rock and neo-romantic, but in a darker and more gothic style. And she wore a lot of black, especially after the 1980s, but often paired with red or other bright colors. Susie Sue is a significant figure known for her immense aesthetic influence, but another post-punk icon would be The Cure, whose style is complex. Initially classified as post-punk and new wave, it later became known as the gothic rock. The band first gained prominence in the 1980s for both its music and intriguing audiovisual creations, often with a horrific edge. Their lyrics explore themes of nightmares and melancholy, exemplified by Lullaby, which tells the tale of a Spider-Man who preys on children at night. And in the music video, the lead singer Robert Smith is trapped in his own nightmare, lying helplessly as the Spider-Man prowls above. Some interpret this as a metaphor for depression that gradually consumes the people it takes a hold of. But going back to the style of Robert Smith, he typically dresses in black, with a pale complexion, black eyes, and vivid red lips. And his hair is styled to stand out. And fun fact, he still maintains the same look today even after so many years. And while I can't introduce all of the bands, there are definitely a lot more, but Susie and Robert Smith are definitely one of the most iconic ones. However, remember that we're still talking about cold wave and post-punk, as it wasn't until the early 1980s that post-punk would finally begin to diverge from punk, where the guitar becomes a lot less aggressive in comparison to punk, with more focus on echoes, rhythms, and synthesizers. Most importantly, we also noticed that the music themes darken a lot. For example, in Joy Division's song, they sing about despair and suicide. So with post-punk, we then have the beginnings of Gothic music. But we're still not talking about Gothic movement. So from what moment can we talk about Gothic movement? So we can say goth became goth after the occurrence of the Batcave Nights. And the Batcave Nights, if you don't know, is organized every Wednesday in London in a nightclub in the Soho district. It has the reputation of having brought together a significant part of alternative styles and notably allowing the emergence of Gothic movement. Yet the Batcave Nights only occurred in between 1982 and 1985, so quite a short period of time. They stood out for their uniqueness and for their atmosphere. And the DJ said there was neither funk nor disco. We found glam rock with David Bowie, punk with Iggy Pop and the Sex Pistols, and of course, post-punk with Joy Division, Susie and the Bedsheets, Swespin, and The Cure, and also many more, alongside a very particular playlist of alternative music. And the Batcave Night also offered shows and concerts. And among the artists who performed there, we have Alien Sex Fiend, Christian Diff, and of course, Specimen themselves, since they were the ones who organized the event. And unfortunately, I haven't found an image that perfectly represents the place, but testimonies have spoken about the entrance, which is shaped like a coffin. And inside, the room is decorated with leather and lace, with decor inspired by horror cinema. And the audience was quite young and free, and it was there that a Gothic style slowly began to emerge. The influence of punk was of course very present. We notably find half-shaved hairstyles, band t-shirts, and ripped clothing. But all of this is mixed with new elements inspired by black romanticism and horror cinema. And the use of makeup will be the most systematic. We find pale complexions reminiscent of that of a corpse, and very dark eyeshadows. And the color black is the most common clothing, but contrary to cliches, there was also colors, such as colored hair. And you'll notice that the style is very androgynous, and this androgyny probably comes from the influences of glam rock, which has a very theatrical and excessive side. But all things considered, it may also be due to the significant presence of women in the post-punk scene, because back then in punk there were actually very few women who were headliners, or else they were in marginalized movements such as riot girls. Whereas in post-punk and gothic scene, there are many more women. In fact, we even have the example of a gothic band, Deutschland, which was composed by entirely women. And on the men's side, we often have artists exploring so-called effeminate characters. And later in gothic culture, androgyny would remain an important element of gothic style. Anyways, after the pivotal moments in Batcave, the gothic movement began to take shape. While some claim that the gothic music started in 1979, with Bach as well as the Gojis did, it's argued that the genre officially occurred in 1983. This period saw the rise of bands like the Sisters of Mercy, The Cult, and The Mission. And at this time they will no longer be classified as post-punk if not gothic rock. Additionally, we also see the development of dark waves blending gothic rock with electric sounds featuring bands like Cocteau Twins, The Chameleons, and Deutschland. And while this genre is gaining a lot of prominence in England, it will finally be exported back to the United States called the death rock, primarily led by Christian Diff. The death rock genre has themes very similar to gothic, with mentions of death or solitude. It is music that has sounds reminiscent of horror films and plays on oppressive atmospheres. And beyond the United States, gothic music will also travel to Spain, Japan, and even France. However, the gothic movement will completely lose its momentum towards the end of the 1980s. So ultimately, it is a very short but condensed period of time. And because of this, it marks the end of the Batcave Nights, with pop and rap gaining more and more prominence over rock music. However, the gothic genre will remain highly influential in Germany, which is the only country where gothic will not disappear at all. On the contrary, it did not reach its peak until the 1990s. And well, if you're into gothic culture, you might have heard of the term trad goth, and you might be wondering, what is trad goth? Trad goth is commonly associated with post-punk and Batcave Nights. It is a term that represents the very beginnings of gothic music, even before it was categorized as such and having so many subgenres. Trad goth features makeup similar to glam rock, often with a very pale complexion and with very dark makeup. The eyeliners are angulated and worked, and with very marked eyebrows. For clothing, it is primarily associated with Batcave look. So now the big question is, why has the trad goth look brought us to where we are today? And why do we classify it as goth or gothic? Well, we'll be explaining this soon. So we have talked a lot about punk, post-punk, and Batcave nights, but that is not the only influence of the gothic movement that we see today. In order to explain more, we would have to talk about gothic art. And yeah, gothic art exists way before gothic music existed. It dates back several centuries. We find it typically in architecture, painting, literature, and even more recently in the theaters. And there is actually a distinction between the term goth and gothic. On one side we have goth, a musical movement from the 1980s. And on the other hand, we have Gothic, which encompasses all the arts and cultures inspired by Gothic elements. But even if these two things are two different things, these two cultures echo each other. Initially, the term Gothic referred to barbaric people, but later it became associated with religious art. Contrarily to being gloomy, Gothic art is actually joyful and decorative, evident in cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts. And in the 18th century, authors bored by the previous century's classical influences decided to turn to medieval era for inspiration. Because in the 17th century, they had drawn significant inspirations from the Greeks, but now they had no more ideas left. So what did they decide? They decided to seek inspiration from the medieval era. This led to the emergence of dark romanticism, where the 18th century romantic authors draw part of their imagination from the past and reappropriate these medieval themes to feed into their imagination. The first Gothic novels, like Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, appeared in the 18th century, where the motif of death is already gaining prominence, and it's a romanticization of the past with fantasized medieval period. And in the 18th century, it was a common thing to romanticize the past centuries and fantasize about the medieval period. Just like how we do with the 1950s and 60s, I guess. Walpole even built a medieval-style castle at that time. However, these early Gothic novels were not really successful. We will have to wait until the early 19th century to have a revival of the dark romanticism and what we will call the neo-Gothic culture, featuring works like The Frankenstein, Mr. Hyde, and Dracula. These novels all explore the dark themes related to human nature, and we often find some sort of fascination towards tragic and horror. Dark romanticism, in simple words, is the writing of melancholy, madness, crime, in a form of beauty. And the authors of dark romanticism had a significant impact on Gothic music. For example, Edgar Allan Poe will notably inspired the Cure with the song Just Like Heaven, which talks about someone who falls in love with a woman who he only sees in his dreams or when he faints, which also explored the theme of love and loss for a woman, and talks about his love for a woman who he can't be with. But Gothic experiences a huge turning point in the 20th century with the occurrence of a new type of art, cinema. Now on screen we can bring to life supernatural and terrifying creatures, such as Dracula or Frankenstein. We find numerous fantasies and horror films, and a lot of other things all inspired by dark romanticism. And now we better understand how Gothic elements or those associated with Gothic culture nourish the imagination of Gothic artists. Gothic music draws from more than just punk. It also incorporates dark romanticism, the fantastic, mystery, and melancholy. Tim Burton, known for his films inspired by Gothic and fantastic literature, reflects his affinity for storytelling and gruesome imaginary. His notable works like Beetlejuice, Edward Scissorhands, Sleepy Hollow, and Sweeney Toad significantly influenced Gothic culture. And in his 1989 Batman film, he features the music by Zuzi and the Banshees in the final scene. And as for Edward Scissorhands, it features a protagonist deeply rooted in Gothic culture. The melancholic character reflects Burton's focus on visual elements and Johnny Depp's performance, highlighting his curly hair, pale complexion, and darkly accentuated eyes to convey emotions. A homage to silent cinema. Edward resides in a Gothic castle isolated from a traditional American small town, embodying classic Gothic storytelling. With all of this being said, we can conclude that the music goth has an intangible impact in the history of modern Gothic art. Yet goth music also took a lot of inspiration from the themes of Gothic art from the past centuries as well. And since the beginning of the 2020s, there has been a renaissance for the Gothic movement. Obviously, Gothic elements have evolved over the 30 years, with more and more musical and visual artists, new subgenres, new derivatives mixed into what we see as modern goth nowadays. It's quite different from what we see in traditional goth in the 80s. So while some may argue that traditional goth no longer exists today and it belongs strictly to the 1980s, others believe it's still here thanks to the community. Social media, particularly TikTok, has played a crucial role in sustaining Gothic culture, with influencers dedicated to preserving it, allowing Gothic culture to enter mainstream popular culture again. To conclude, Gothic music has significantly influenced Gothic art, contributing to a global movement while achieving aesthetic renewal. Anyways, I think this video is gonna get a little bit too long, so with everything being said, let's put an end to this video. Thank you so much for watching this and staying until the end, and let's see you in the next one. Bye!